Welcome back to the Horizons Review. I'm here with Cody again, and today we're going to talk about a couple of different related short books. One is a series of sermons that, uh, back when he was still Joseph Ratzinger, that Pope Benedict XVI gave on the theme of creation. And the other is a text from the late antique theologian Maximus the Confessor, the Seventh Ambiguum. And a good question is, for example, like, why would you read these like highly specifically Christian texts at all if you didn't have an interest in Christian theology um, or debates? And I think we are often lacking a certain amount of intellectual architecture sometimes for discussing things like um, the nature of personhood or the nature of objects and the nature of mankind's relationship to other persons and also other creatures, the world itself. Um, and we're often quite willing to look at non Western religious traditions for possible philosophical insights. But for some reason, there's been a much sharper division in the academy between Western religious thought and philosophy. I mean, there are obvious historical reasons for this, but to such a degree that it's mostly specifically Christian philosophers that bother to engage with this at all. And often, sometimes there's even an amount of embarrassment
Hmm.
that you see among people who do this, with the possible exception of Thomists. Um, that oftentimes people are trying to justify these people as existing in some pre-existing philosophical tradition, which then gives them some sort of cachet. We'll talk a little bit about what Maximus might be pulling from the non-Christian tradition when we discuss Maximus. But the case I want to make is like these are ideas about what people are, what our relationship is to each other, what the structure of everyday objects is. Um, like we somehow struggle philosophically to come up with coherent definitions of what makes an object an object. Why are arbitrary groupings of things not as much of an object as any object made of parts, for example? Um, and I think there's interesting furniture, and you can take this furniture, you can rearrange it, you can do things with it, and you can also just ask yourself, like, does this make sense as a view of the world? And it can then open up your horizons to maybe look at some other texts that you wouldn't otherwise look at. Um, so, Cody, you're the one who suggested these sermons by Ratzinger on creation. So, why don't you sort of give the why you wanted to talk about these in particular?
Yeah, sure. So I first got interested in Ratzinger and I guess Pope Benedict XVI. His thought when I specifically was reading about Friedrich Hayek, and for a while I was very interested in Hayek, specifically his view of complex systems, um, the role of intellectuals in society. And back in, I think, like 1980 something, when Ratzinger was still a priest, he wasn't even a bishop yet. He went on a radio program with Hayek in Austria on the role of intellectuals in society. And it's Hayek, Ratzinger, and like three other economists who don't even have Wikipedia pages. And it all starts with Hayek coming out, and he says, uh, oh, this is a radio program. Radio is where intellectualism goes to die, and I'm going to kill it right now. And he says, basically, intellectuals are bad for the world. They oftentimes have opinions on things that really they have no expertise on. They tend to, he calls them junk dealers in ideas. They take ideas from other people, claim them as their own, and then try to get some level of um, prestige based on that. And the three other panelists immediately just laugh at Hayek, and they're like, this guy's a fool. Like, he's a clown. Like, why are we academics if we're not saying anything anyways? Like, we hate him. Don't listen to him. Everyone in the audience should go home and still listen to us. And as the time on this program is running short, eventually it gets to Ratzinger, and he has this very sober approach. He says, you guys just laughed at everything this guy said, but I think there's a good point here. And namely, it's that intellectuals, one, don't talk much about anything human. That in our kind of Western scientific system, we've taken the human, we've turned the human into an object of study, and we've left out all of the very fundamental things about our phenomenology, about care for one another, about how we could best organize society to allow for flourishing rather than the advancement of metrics and things. And I was kind of blown away when I read this, because Ratzinger is saying, it's horrible that what's happened is you've ceded all the ground to theologians like myself. And I'm not saying we've done the best job at talking about the human condition, but we're one of the few groups that are seriously willing to engage with it. So I chose his book In the Beginning, which is, as Kyle said, kind of a collection of 4 homilies he gave specifically, I think, during Pascha or during the Easter season, during Lent, where he just wanted to talk about the creation accounts and his view of what the human being is. And so basically using the creation account from Genesis as a sort of marker stone for discussing these issues, he kind of goes through several accounts of, what is the human being? What is that humans are here to do? Or what is it that we have to figure out as persons in the world? What is the relationship between us and the rest of creation or everything around us? And then finally, what are the kind of personal pacts that we owe to each other, to the world, and to God that might be able to guide some of our behavior? And he was a really brilliant writer. He truly was a philosopher and theologian of the highest degree. And this really short book that I think anyone can read, I mean, it's less than 100 pages, kind of goes all over the place in terms of covering, I think, really the breadth of his social thought. You find discussions of not just creation and pagan history and whatnot, but also, he's talking about Laplace's demons, and he's talking about Hegel at some point, and he's saying, actually, I agree with Kant more so than any other philosopher on this.
Yeah.
And so I thought this might be a good place to kind of discuss his worldview and how it has bearing on the human condition.
Yeah. One thing I think that's interesting about these is, like, from a theological point of view, the homilies are laid out in a very rational way, where he's just working his way through the text of the Genesis accounts. But from a secular point of view, he almost buries the lead.
Yeah.
Because it works up to this claim that at some point something happened in Western thought which reduced the idea of nature. And he kind of comes up with 2 theses of, like, what's happened here. And one is the reduction of the discourse of nature to those things which are visible to the natural sciences as an instrument.
So this is similar to the Polanyi point on basically, a certain set of scientists and philosophers tried to put us in, like, Pythagoras's world.
Yeah. And once again, he's not even condemning of that, like, necessarily. Like, he tends to have a pretty high view of natural science in general and its accomplishments. But he does say that it did cause this reduction in the scope of what we mean when we do this inquiry into nature. And then the other critique he makes is one specifically of Luther, where
Mm-hmm.
portrays Luther as, like, looking for an escape from the created order in his thought. And that's something I'm just not enough of an expert on Luther and Lutheranism to really evaluate how accurate that is as a portrayal of Luther's thought.
Yeah.
Like to the extent that I've read Luther, it's mostly specifically on the theological question of justification. And his wider thought, I've only sampled very rarely.
Hmm.
So I just don't have a good handle on this. Like I don't have a sort of like strong intellectual Protestant background or anything like that. So um I'm willing to grant for the sake of argument that Ratzinger is correct in this characterization, but I also don't think it's even particularly important. Um it's possible that the rise of empirical science is enough of an explanatory factor. Um, but there is this strange there's something strange here where I do think if you start to do the analysis, it happens also in the Middle Ages.
Hmm.
Um, there is a tendency in mysticism, Christian mysticism, both in the Greek and in the Latin traditions, to sort of escape from the body and from the created order into a more intellectual
Right.
domain, a purely intellective domain. And to that degree, there is a sort of reduction of of the natural, the physical order.
I take him to be aligning Luther
Yeah.
with something like that.
Yes.
It seems that his thesis is that there are kind of the book starts off with him basically saying there's like a philosophical attack right now on the
Yeah.
natural world and our place in it, and
Yeah.
it's going to lead to the destruction of the earth. And he says this attack is coming from two sides. One is this like, Giga Greek Newton and Leibnizian kind of thing that says, let's just reduce nature to mathematical laws. And then the other one is this one you're talking about, which is almost a rejection of the Greek that says, well, let's not even reduce nature. Let's just not talk about it as relevant to humans and the human condition. Um, Maybe we can get outside of it and like just ignore that humans are a part of this whole thing.
Yeah. I will say that the one thing that I do know about Luther, which I have looked into before, that did make me like slightly wonder how accurate this impression is that he roots this in Luther's rejection of the Greek inheritance
Mm-hmm.
of Christianity. But like many things in Luther, there's multiple Luthers. Luther was like a man who was very much driven by his passions in the moment. And yeah, especially early on in the Reformation, like he's saying, like he's calling the works of Aristotle worthless, and you should like go burn them.
Oh, really?
And but then later on, he's very happy to start using Aristotelian arguments again and to endorse he does give an endorsement. It's specifically of the Nicomachean ethics.
Mm-hmm.
He actually has good things specifically to say about that in the future. So it's like, yeah, it's like you can find this in Luther, but like you can find all sorts of very extreme statements in Luther because he was like at heart he was a polemicist. He would have killed it on Twitter. Like
Yeah.
whatever the controversy of the day was, like Luther would have been able to have an opinion about it and defend it ferociously.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, the question of like what's truest to Lutheranism and Protestantism as a tradition, like I just don't know what a good answer to that is. Um, but so let's sort of go through um, what why like creation as a theme is so important.
Yeah.
And so I think for what he ends up saying is like the important thing is human beings' own recognition of themselves as created things,
Right.
as not being self-sufficient. And to work up to this, he actually goes through, like, tries to draw out like what the definition of sin is.
Mm-hmm.
And this is in part because he's reflecting on the creation stories and uh you know, Adam and Eve at the tree of knowledge and good of evil. That's the first sin in the Bible. So he's trying to grapple with this question of what sin is and what specifically original sin is.
Yeah, what is it
And
that the snake actually did to them? What was it
yeah,
that the snake convinced them of?
and yeah, I thought about this. There's like the famous line of Niebuhr's that original sin is the one empirically verifiable dogma of Christianity. And it seems like such a strange thing to say because, like, original sin is like this incredibly fraught theological concept with a lot of baggage depending on what your interpretation of it is. But then when you start to think about it, well, you just look around the world and you go, well, yeah, like, things are messed up and everyone is doing bad things. Like, you know, you look even at very young people and they already, like, their desires are twisted and uh things are obviously wrong. So
Yeah.
to that extent, like, yeah, then original sin is empirically verifiable. And Ratzinger comes up with this, like, very nice definition of what sin is for him.
Mm-hmm.
And it's anything that damages your relationship with the world or with others. And I think this is interesting from a number of ways. One, it roots the idea of sin in the idea that we are all dependent beings. We're dependent on not just each other, but on the rest of the natural order around us. We're in relation to all these things. Um, Two, it provides a definition. It provides a relatively rational definition of what sin is. Like, you don't have to have any religious beliefs to go, all right, I'll accept this idea that we're all in relations and those relations can be damaged. Um, a lot of times in modern ethics, we really, really struggle with the idea of that there can be ethical harms that don't directly impinge on another person.
Yeah.
So, like, the idea that, like, the lone drug abuser who's not inflicting himself on others um, could be possibly doing some sort of ethical harm is really hard. It's really hard to figure out how that is for a lot of people. But you can come up with the reasons why, and it's like, well, no, because he's, like, removing himself away from society in order to, like, engage in this thing that further removes him, like, insulates him from relationships. Um, like, that is what the sin is. It's this damaging of the human social fabric, and that human social fabric which exists in the overall fabric of the earth.
Yeah, I think he would also say that the addict has damaged a relationality with themselves.
Yeah,
That not coming to grip, with what they're doing to themselves, right? Or oftentimes, they know that what they're doing is harmful to themselves, but they're violating this personal relationship, this obligation that they have, and therefore that's something of a sin. He expands on this elsewhere in some of his other texts, where he talks about sin as like a violation of reason, and specifically this, like, violation of reason is to turn the rest of the world into objects.
yeah,
So to objectify, say, personal experience, right? I do this because it's pleasurable, not because it has some inherent good. Or, when I steal from someone, I've objectified their belongings and
yeah.
what is theirs in some way, and turn them into objects and destroy that relationship that I.
Which is very Kantian. Like,
Yeah, yeah,
you see why he likes Kant so much, because that is a very good expression of the type of ethics that
yeah.
he's outlining.
Both him and John Paul II had this very interesting relationship with Kant, and Kant, famously had kind of a relationship with Aristotle and had a little bit of beef with the way that physics was being done, and um, descriptions of the natural world were happening. Yeah, I think that they're taking Kant and this using other people um, as means very seriously, in a way that I suspect that if Kant was born like 2,500 years ago, he would be classified as one of these pre-Christian, non-Christian philosophers, just because it is so compatible with.
Yeah, and he's also warning against using the natural world like
Mm-hmm.
merely as
Yeah,
a means to your particular ends as well. And but it's interesting, like there is something to note is that he actually, in one of his sort of manifestations of the rejection of nature, one of his manifestations of that rejection is actually anti-technological thinking.
yeah,
Like he's writing this before Ted Kaczynski, but like you could see that he would go, yeah, this is anti-nature thinking. Like human beings create technology. The question is, um, does that technology sort of fulfill the goodness of human social ends and the goodness of the earth
yeah.
as well? Um, like, uh, I remember one time having um, this thought, um, looking at an exposed layer of marble. And I'm just thinking about the idea as like, all right, so there are eons of creatures that deposited their shells to make limestone, and then eons of metamorphosis to lead it to become this particular kind of stone. And in this funny way, it almost seems to exist for like the pure whimsy of human art.
Yeah.
It is this sort of thing where you look at it, you go, huh. It's like nature created this thing, and then it just happens to be the perfect material, and then people can create these marvelous structures,
That's a good point.
reliefs
Yeah.
out of it. Um, and it's an interesting question. Is that actually using the natural world correctly? Is to recognize like sort of the excellence of a particular material
Hmm.
and what you can bring out of it.
Yeah, I mean, this whole view on technology is really, I think, one of the highlights of his homilies. He has this beautiful section, the one where he like explicitly invokes Kant, where he says, the fate of all of us depends on whether the moral dignity of the human person can be defended in the world of technology with all its possibilities.
Yeah.
For here, a particular temptation exists for a technical scientific age. The technical and scientific attitude has produced a particular kind of certitude, namely that which can be corroborated by way of experience and mathematical formula.
Yeah.
And I take him to be saying, on some level, we have these impressive technologies. We can see all the very cool, quantifiable things that it can do for us. But at the same time, we have to um, think about these things in terms of, what are they doing for us morally? Is it the case that we have to step back? I think about this specifically in the case of AI, right? We have to step back and think about what is it that we're losing, what is that we're using these for. You have now like AI pornography generators where I think you can like upload pictures of your friends and basically put them in porn, right? This is clearly like a significant moral violation versus something that, if ChatGPT, for instance, is used in the right way, can open up, new ways of learning mathematics or something. So he's not saying that, technology in all of its instances is bad and we should be skeptical of it. But that we have to have actually very, what he calls practical, reasonable discussions about what these mean for us in a moral religious context when we adopt them.
Yeah. I actually want to pick up the Chat GPT question later. So
Yeah.
remind me if I forget, because there's something interesting in the fact that it deals with language itself
Hmm.
that we'll get to when we talk about Maximus.
Yeah.
Um, Another thing that I thought was really interesting is like, so he's not just talking about the existence of sin, he also talks about the existence of guilt. That
Yeah.
actually part of recognizing yourself as a creature among creatures is recognizing that you have guilt,
Yeah.
that you've done things that have damaged your relationships with other creatures and with yourself. And he actually attributes the absence of
Hmm.
the knowledge and recognition of guilt to things like the horrible tone of modern democratic politics. And reminder, he's writing this in the mid 80s.
Yeah.
Things are
Yeah.
going to get much worse.
Yeah. It was very prescient. Yeah.
Um, and I do think that's really interesting. I think about this a lot when um, I opened a TikTok account recently because I was like, maybe I'll like try to put some material for this on that other network and see how it goes.
Sure.
And like the first thing it starts serving up to me is like this horrible like gender war slop.
Hmm.
It's like either women saying horribly insensitive things or like men condemning women for saying horribly insensitive things or men saying etc. It's like because it knows that that's going to like get eyeballs.
Yeah.
And all I think about when I see that stuff is these are people that have never thought about their own sins.
Hmm.
Like they've never thought about how they've damaged um, their relationship with another person.
Yeah. It's
Uh,
very fascinating, this discussion of, it really does seem like he's railing on like modern criminology at some point in the book, where he says, look, at this point we have this discussion of things like crime or vice as, we take a very like quantitative statistical view of it, like, oh, X leads to Y and then Z happens. There's this like impersonal account. Um, and he says part of what it's done is it like you said, it alienated us from the concept of guilt. We don't want to punish people, to take like Robert Sapolsky or whatever, who's totally non-determin or totally deterministic about human views. He's skeptical that we should have certain kinds of punishment in society. And Benedict is tying this specifically to what quantification has done. That we no longer want to say people are responsible for guilt, because in part it requires us to also take responsibility for the things we've done, right? We can talk about these things statistically, say, oh, society's all out of whack. But the second that you say, I think that person did a bad thing, actually means that you too, or all of us, are capable of doing bad things. And so, in a sense, what we're doing is we're hiding from guilt
yeah,
in our modern discussion of things like crime.
yeah. There's a line in Plotinus that I think about relatively frequently when people are discussing crime and law and like what's good and what isn't. And it goes something like he's like, what can he say about justice who has like not beheld its face and seen
Mm.
it as more beautiful than the morning and evening star? And I think there's like something real about that
Yeah,
and the nature of law and society. But in order to like look on the face of justice and see it as beautiful, you also have to see yourself as a criminal.
yeah.
So, anyways, like to sum up uh, what's going on in uh, these lectures on creation is the idea is like one, it's the recognition that we are natural beings in a natural order. Uh, for the Christian, this is obviously a created order, but
Hmm.
you can sort of make the reduction and say what he means by this is a natural order that we come out of. We are not apart from the rest of nature. We're on some continuum with it.
Yeah, this kind
Uh,
of explication of Genesis is really fascinating. Him specifically saying, well, creation, the point of the creation narrative is to say that things were created,
Yeah.
and that when they were created, they were good. They were done, in a sense, with purpose. Not that, we were thrown into some messed up, broken world that is inherently evil, but that actually we come from the same stuff as the world. Um, and that in some way, the world is good. The world is a part of a kind of past, a future, and a present, that all of us can kind of account for via the creation narrative.
Yeah. Yeah, because something that's important to point out is that in keeping with the mainstream opinion in post Vatican II Catholicism,
Mm,
Ratzinger is not anti evolution. He's not against the idea of an old Earth,
yeah.
or anything like that. Like he reads, these narratives are read with the idea that modern science has revealed truths in the book of nature that
Hmm.
were not necessarily known to prior generations.
Yeah.
And we can sort of discuss more what that might mean from a theological perspective once we sort of get deeper into what Maximus is doing.
Hmm.
But I actually do, unless you have anything else to say about uh, the the Ratzinger homilies specifically, I do think this is a good place to depart for, and like why we're tying Ambiguum 7 into
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, I'll just add that in addition to creation being something reasonable and something good, this is also ties into his perspective of what humanity is and what kind of the Catholic social thought on this is. That the human being is this individual that has a future, that many ideologies tend to discount either our past or our future. There's this bias towards presentism in accounting for, I want things to be good right now, rather than good in the future. And that a problem with a lot of modern social thought is that when we think about what's good, um, oftentimes we're counting people out of the equation. And he says this is easy to do because actually it's really hard even for an individual person to discover what their humanity is. But really, it's kind of the big social project that all of us have. That, in his view, Catholic teachings kind of guides you into, um, and then allows you to discuss, what is good for society. How is it that we should actually arrange things to be around each other? And I think the person that really picks this up kind of in full is John Paul II, in his text "Person and Act," where he takes this kind of uh, very personal view of the human being and tries to scale it up, to how is it that we should have a society built around each other. And so I just say that I really think that Catholic social thought has a lot to offer, in terms of these discussions of sociology and um, modern ethics of society and technology. And the Ratzinger text in particular, I think, is a good introduction, to kind of point you in the direction of things to look for.
Yeah. Yeah, so when you brought up that you wanted to tie these things together, I wasn't quite certain
Hmm.
like the reason for tying these together. But then I realized after reading the Ratzinger homilies that what they are is they're relatively philosophically sparse.
Hmm.
They don't provide they provide a lot of sort of the surface description
He's
of
giving you the
relations,
platitudes.
right? But not sort of like what would be a philosophical architecture that would let you talk about this in a
Yeah.
more rigorous way. And actually, I think Ambiguum 7 goes a long way to
Yeah.
providing a reasonable philosophical architecture uh, that backs up these kind of ideas. Um, so Ambiguum 7 is kind of, in a way, it's the genesis of this entire podcast.
Hmm.
If I think back to it, because I think it was I'm pretty sure it was when you were accepted into Orthodoxy. I sent you a copy of a collection of Maximus's writings, and I
That's
like
right.
wrote in the front that like Ambiguum 7 had kind of like been my lodestone
Hmm.
for the past 20 years almost. 20 years at this point, almost
Yeah,
back then. Because it is this incredibly rich text with a lot going on. Speaking, even though it's very short, you can read it. You could sit down and read it in, depending on how fast you read, like 5 to 25 minutes.
hmm
Um, but I've probably read this. I definitely have read this text more than probably any single like non-liturgical text or non-poetic
hmm
text. There are definitely poems that I've read more often than this. Um, but yeah, I don't even think any of the dialogues of Plato I've read as frequently as I've reread this, and I'm always finding some other little nook or cranny that's going on when I reread it, and because I do think this is great to read because even if you, for example, aren't interested in the questions about ontology and Mariology that this addresses, or the questions of sort of like what is the nature of the cosmos and the person. There's also it's relatively subtle, but there's also an interesting idea of what the self is that's
hmm
implicit in this. Like once again, and it is interesting because even though he's never talking about it, so this is some important context. Maximus, his entire life almost is consumed with this theological debate that seems relatively arcane, which is the question of whether Christ had one or two wills. Did he have just a divine will, or did he have a human will and a divine will? And it comes out of yet another obscure controversy whether or not Christ had one or two natures.
in
Uh,
the ancient world, you would die for having the wrong opinion on
and
this.
Maximus, in fact, did die for
Yeah.
having what the emperor felt was the wrong opinion. I mean, he basically dies of his injuries. He doesn't die immediately, but they cut off his hand, they cut out his tongue, and he dies within a few weeks or few months after suffering this torture and mutilation. And so he's not considered a martyr because he isn't sort of directly killed, but that's why he bears the title the Confessor.
Hmm.
Um, and it, it, these debates are very interesting because they're had with incredible ferocity. But the basic questions of like, what do we mean by nature? What do we mean by will? Are never, those never get firmly planted in the ground. And if you're asking a believing Christian, like why this might be, you're like, well, we're trying not to over define dogma. So what we're saying is whatever nature is, Christ had both a human and a divine one. Because otherwise he would have not been fully man and fully God.
Hmm.
Whatever the will is, Christ definitely has like a human one and a divine one. And whether those are even the same sort of thing at all is a very interesting question. And I believe Maximus would say that they aren't. That they are of completely different genus. Um,
Yeah, it's really fascinating because the essay, uh, the ambiguum, like starts with discussing things like, what is the nature of creation and the created order and so on and so forth, and then towards the end, and he's like, and by the way, the soul and body, this is how they work together.
yeah,
It kind of comes out of nowhere, and you're like, oh right, he was actually making an argument here.
yeah. It is funny. Like it often feels like there's this feeling in a lot of his writings that he's writing about something else, and he always manages like he's a uh he always manages to work it back in
Yeah.
to his core material that he's trying to get out there. Um, but what I mean by like the fact that he thinks of these things, I believe as different things altogether,
Mm-hmm.
is actually in his doctrine of being itself, which is implicit in Ambiguum 7, but it's not as directly and aggressively stated as it is in some other places in his writing. Um, the one that I think about a lot is in the Ecclesiastical Mystagogy. He's like saying, all right, here's what we know being is. And what he means by that is like, we know what the being of creatures is.
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, whatever God's being is, it's so different from that than it is proper to say that he has no being at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is proper to say that he does not exist. He actually goes that far. It's like, if you're thinking that existence is to have creaturely being, then it's proper to say God does not exist. And in this, maybe he's being, if Heidegger is right, he's being a good Aristotelian.
Right.
That he's got the two senses of being. He's got the being of the first mover and the being of beings.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, that's definitely a future podcast. Whether Heidegger is right about Aristotle. Um, but he starts out, so all the ambigua, they're dealing with some difficult text in a prior Christian writer that would cause someone maybe to stumble or to have the wrong idea. And he's dealing here with a text from Gregory the Theologian. And the important part of this text is that Gregory says, we are that portion of God that flowed down from above. And the fear is that this would be read in terms of Origenism. So Origen was another early Christian thinker, and he had this entire system that ultimately gets wrapped up in a sort of eternal return,
Mm-hmm.
that all beings are gathered up with God originally. They grow somehow satiated with God or want something else. They fall from that perfection, then are redeemed, lifted back up, but that seems to repeat itself.
Yeah.
And actually, and it's very interesting because it does, if you look at Origenism as a system, it begins to feel a lot like um, Indic
Yeah. Yeah.
systems. So it is kind of funny because Gregory the theologian's friend, Gregory of Nyssa, actually discusses this idea of like
Mm-hmm.
this eternal cycle of satiety, reincarnation, etc. And he's like, if this is true, it would be the most miserable of the existences.
Yeah.
And it is kind of
Samsara.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it is kind of funny, but it's like instead of having the reaction that the Buddha does, which is, okay, so we got to escape this because it's obviously miserable in hell.
Yeah.
Instead, Gregory of Nyssa's take is, this is obviously so miserable it cannot be true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's just like such an absurd system that you would believe that this is true, that it cannot be true. Like he sort of that is actually his rejection of that system, is sort of like it's so miserable it can't possibly be the truth. And whatever you think about that as an argument, that is effectively the argument that Gregory of Nyssa is giving in On the Soul and Resurrection.
I was going to say that this idea of eternal recurrence is like, it does have some nice, validity, systemic validity, and is kind of a difficult problem to deal with. I think,
Yeah.
especially, in an era where, you know, purpose of creation and redemption, right, is brought into the picture. That's like not really something easy to lay out. Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, why would we be made? Um,
Yeah. And
perfect in God's image if we were just going to like kind of get bored of him, and why wouldn't we expect that to happen again?
yeah, it is also, I think, I've never quite been able to decide why this happens, but it seems like Christianity's greatest critic is Nietzsche.
Mhm.
And he arrives at the idea of the eternal return of the same, like through that rejection. And like what exactly, like it makes perfect sense reading him, but like what exactly is the logical process that leads you back to the idea of the eternal return?
Hmm.
Um, like that's a difficult exegetical problem
I
in
mean, it's
Nietzsche.
probably
Yeah,
similar to Gregory of Nyssa saying, "Well, it's kind of cruel to be made just to
yeah,
fall," right? Which is like what Maximus is confronting. That he's like, "Well, it's not that we were like made to fall in the sense that we immediately fell away from God as some kind of purpose, but actually there's a deeper thing happening here, which is this concept of growth and teleology."
yeah,
Um,
yeah. The difference is, unlike every other proponent of the eternal return, Nietzsche is like, no, you have to be an enthusiastic endorser.
yeah.
Like, like that's actually how you overcome nihilism, is that you just sort of like will that this is going to happen again and again and again for eternity.
You just accept Sisyphus's condition and
Yeah.
you're happy with it. Yeah.
So anyways, what this whole ambiguum like seems to be on this like relatively minor topic of just trying to like say, hey, Gregory the theologian, by saying that we were like part of God that fell from God, doesn't mean that he's endorsing Origenism here. He's not saying that there were pre-existing souls that uh, came down from the heavenly realm and took on gross creatureliness. Uh, that he's saying something else. And one of the interesting things that happens here is the inversion in Maximus of something that most of the ancient philosophical schools agreed upon, which is that the passibility of human beings, like they're being subject to passions,
Mhm.
is a flaw. Um, and Maximus actually says, you know, he does say like the end is impassibility, but then he redefines impassibility as being God. And we can come up with like what exactly he means by that as we go deeper into his system. But he says, no, passibility is actually what makes us human.
Mhm.
It's the fact that we can desire something other than ourselves at all is something that defines us.
Yeah.
Um, without the passibility that we are created with, you know, in a way you could say like life would have no ethical meaning.
Mhm.
Um, and there would certainly be no freedom. And freedom is very important on a strangely fundamental level to the metaphysical system that he starts working out. Um, so he ends up coming up with this like, well, okay, so he's working within the Christian context. God is three persons. One of them is the Logos, the Word. And from the prologue of John, it's like, oh, by the Word all things were created, and in him were all things. And so, like, what does that mean? And Maximus says, okay, well, they're the logoi, which is the plural of logos, which are these like pre-existent ideas, words, accounts of beings.
Small L logos. Yeah.
Yeah, that exist. Uh, and every created thing has its logos. Um,
It's very Aristotelian, right?
yeah,
Like
and it defines. And the important thing is that the logos isn't so much a substance or a universal. It's more about defining the telos, the proper end of that being. And in fact, there is in Ambiguum 7 a rare uh, reference to a non-Christian writer, and it's a gloss on Aristotle's metaphysics, and he says like this person who did not share our faith, spoke truly when he said, uh, "The end is that for which the sake of all things exist." Um, that things exist and they have their definition because of their proper end. And it is interesting that this sort of like teleological view of objects and substances, and there's been a revival of it over the past 20 years or so in philosophy.
Final cause, yeah.
Yeah. But Maximus's system is different in some ways because it's not just that things are defined by their proper end, but that end doesn't have to be like there's nothing inevitable about the proper end of things.
Mm-hmm.
And this is obviously clearest in the case of human beings. And they have what he calls the tropos, which is like their mode of actual existence. And that mode of actual existence does not have to be in keeping with the logos of that particular person at all. So he has this triad that he works through, which is like, you move from being to well-being to eternal well-being. Mm-hmm. And sort of being is just, it's your mere existence almost. And then well-being is when your tropos aligns with your logos, that you're actually doing the thing that you should be doing to fulfill your proper end in the world. And then there's eternal well-being, which is when you're directed properly towards God. Mm-hmm. And obviously, like, if you were a secular person trying to, like, mine this for some ideas about human nature or mereology, you'd probably, you'd stop at you'd stop at well-being.
Yeah. I mean, this is, we already talk about things like cancer cells in this way, right? Which is that the cell, comes to its origin. It has this, in a sense, goal in mind of what it has to do. But sometimes this goal gets out of whack and the cell forgets. This language is used. The cell forgets what its original function is, right?
Yeah.
So its tropos is not in line with its telos.
Yeah.
It's
and just like, and it's interesting too. It's like, okay, so if God, he doesn't actually like use this term. He never calls God like the unmoved mover or anything like that. But he is defining creatures as that which is movable. Like all created things have a movement. Yeah. And this is important because these are also the terms that are used by originistic thinkers. Is like, okay, so you have movement, then you have stasis, and then you have like a fall. So, and he says, well, yes, you have movement. There's a natural end to that movement, which is well-being. And then there's an ultimate end, which is eternal well-being to that movement. And he does call that rest.
Yeah, he calls it rest.
But it is interesting because this sometimes in some translations of Maximus, and I can't remember if it's like this in the translation that I gave you. There's a passage where he talks instead about the ecstasy of beings towards the creator. Mm-hmm. And the word he uses is ecstasis, which is the etymology of ecstasy. But the problem is the problem with translating it that way is you lose the immediate sense of the Greek, which is the beings can't stand still. that actually whatever the rest is that beings have, it's also itself a movement. And that makes perfect sense when you think, okay, well, he believes that the being of created things are so unlike the being of God that they could never come at some sort of like pantheistic union with the divine.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever the end of resurrected humanity is in the Christian system, it can't ever be some sort of like ceased achieved state.
Yeah, it's still
The
this
the
movement
gulf,
towards.
yeah, the gulf always remains infinite between creatures and God, even though he does use the language of what's called theosis, of creatures, becoming like God or becoming gods. Uh, but that's still only relative. It's like more it's relative to the way that creatures are now, uh, versus actually becoming the same genus as the creator.
I found this also fascinating, specifically thinking about, that he does say this is something that refers to creatures, right? Saying that, something that is unmoved, now it's moving towards something, it has a telos, right? And the question is like, what is it that living systems, what is it that persons are moving towards, right? He's like, there's this concept that things in movement have to come to rest. But what is that they're resting in?
Yeah,
Which is something that I didn't see much of Aristotle necessarily discussing. It's not. It's something that I know Kant kind of wrestled with a little bit in Critique of Judgment, in terms of, okay, like I acknowledge that at least components of organisms have some kind of telos, but what is really the ultimate telos of these created things?
yeah, yeah. It is interesting too because like this is another, you could say, empirically verifiable dogma of Christianity, but it's also an empirically verifiable dogma of Buddhism, which is basically like the unsatisfactoriness
Yeah,
of what we can grasp.
yeah,
It's, um, you know, as Augustine puts it, I'm restless until I rest in you.
hmm
Um, so, there's different solutions to this fundamental dissatisfaction between the two, but it's certainly part of the human condition
yeah,
is
and he
continual grasping for something that's just out of reach.
Yeah, and he does this really beautiful thing when he's discussing, and I think this is kind of the clever trick in terms of saying, why is it that he's answering, like, why is it that we were created in part in Ambiguum 7? Um, and his point seems to be like, oh, in order to understand why things have a beginning, you have to understand them as their end, right? And so, actually, at a thing's origin, it already has, in a sense, its final cause built in. And so, really, almost you have to argue, it was necessary for something like redemption for there to be a fall. It was necessary for creation to happen in such a way, that you would get to this point of rest, because otherwise the only thing that has rest without movement, is something that's uncreated, which we know we are not.
Yeah. And this is so I'm talking about like, okay, so we have God, which is the word, reason, the account, however you want to translate it. And there are these like little accounts that belong to each being. And Maximus also then has, like within this system, um, an explanation for like a metaphysical explanation for what Ratzinger is talking
Yeah.
about restoring relationships, not just between human beings, but between uh, all of creation. Because for Maximus, the end of human beings properly is to order creation. It's to bring out the proper telos of creation, of the created order itself, and offer it back up to God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, this is why like one of the the seminal studies that kind of revived Maximus in the 20th century is Hans Urs von Balthasar's Cosmic Liturgy.
Hmm.
And like that title refers to the idea of that the entire cosmos, like the entire created order, is like this grand setting for this offering back up
Mm.
that happens. And Maximus talks about this elsewhere in Ambiguum 41. He actually sort of like he moves up this hierarchy of like fundamental divisions
Yeah.
that exist in creation. And he's like, all right, well, there's in human beings, there's the division between male and female, like that they clearly have these like different roles and different ends, and then there's the division between paradise and the inhabited world, which is very obscure, interesting to think about what's going on there. And he says, then there's the division between heaven and earth, and then there's the division between the intelligible and the sensible. And he says the task of human beings is sort of to bridge
Yeah.
each of these divisions in order. So the division between male and female in some way has to be bridged. Um, yeah, Balthazar like has this question about like whether Maximus is insufficiently bodily in this combining of male and female. He's like, you almost get the impression that he's like, does he realize what sex is? Uh, there's a passage which almost goes to that point. But then he's like, okay, so there's this division between paradise and the inhabited world, the ecumene.
Hmm.
Um, and there are other places where this is implicit in Maximus, but it seems to be that he has some idea of like what some people call meta-historical fall. That uh, the drama of sort of the creation of human nature and the beginning of sin happens. It's in an in a sensible realm, but it is somehow other
Hmm.
than the one that we inhabit. And whatever the world we inhabit is, it's the world that is the consequence
Yeah.
of sin, um, which inverts it doesn't it subverts a lot of what you would say is traditional natural law, where traditional natural law is like you should be able to look at the natural world
Right.
and find some clear moral lessons. But instead, here we have the idea that no, like the world itself is all downhill of this warped relationship between logos and tropos, and we should in fact expect things to be out of whack.
So
Uh, but not that we can't learn from the world.
so
That's still in there. But
you wouldn't take him to be saying that the division between paradise and the inhabited world is paradise is that world where, to invoke Benedict XVI, the relationality is correct.
yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah, it's a sensible world where the fall did not happen or has not affected it.
Right.
Um, and like I never get the sense like there's in some apocryphal Christian material, there's like the belief that the Garden of Eden is a place on earth
Right.
that is somehow inaccessible. And that's not an idea that you actually find that frequently in theological writers.
Hmm.
Like that idea that it's like a definite physical location on this planet that if it weren't for an angel guarding the gates,
Guarding it with the
you you
sword.
you, you
Yeah.
could walk into it.
Yeah.
Um, that it does seem to be some different order entirely,
Hmm.
and that does seem to be the case in Maximus. So, okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that in some sense, the end of humans as persons is to reshape the entire cosmos into being like paradise.
Yeah.
Is for everything to be in its correct relationship to each other thing.
Yeah, this is like Benedict XVI saying the purpose of talking about the Garden of Eden was to discuss the world in such a state that it's nurturing, that we can rely on it,
Yeah.
that it's something that we treat with care, rather than the wilderness in
Yeah.
contrast, which is this kind of scary place that we are pretty much living in now.
Yeah. And then there's the division between heaven and earth, which we don't have to go into at length. But I would say, like, once again, shouldn't read it as like he's like merely talking about, let's say, like the ancient construction of the world where there's like a sphere of fixed
Yeah.
stars and that's heaven, and a union between that. Like heaven here stands for the angelic realm.
Mhm.
So also like the realm of angels, and the division between that realm and the physical universe has to be bridged. And then the last thing is the division between the intelligible and the sensible itself. That somehow the world of thought and the world of the tactile have to be in harmony
Mhm.
with each other again. Um, so it is a very interesting full system, but like you can just bring it back down to like that second level, which is like, all right, so even if it doesn't happen perfectly until the eschaton, part of your proper end is actually to improve creation, is to make this world more of the sort of place that it should be
Yeah.
versus the place that it is.
To bring about the new Zion as best as you can.
Yeah, is that there actually is this ethical imperative, and it is interesting. There are a number of uh, theologians who've tried to draw on some of these ideas for the idea of like coming up with an ecological ethic.
Mhm.
Um, I've not been too impressed with any of these attempts so far, but that doesn't mean that I think that they're unworthy or this isn't like a proper avenue. I do think if you're going to try to discover a specifically ecological ethic in
Mhm.
Christianity, like this would be the sort of metaphysical system
Yeah.
that you would want to be underpinning it. Um, but yeah, so this logos, like, it's not the being of beings because it pre-exists the being of beings. It is something else.
It's unmoved.
Defines
Yeah.
it defines it because it comes from God. It's pre-existent. It defines what these beings are, but it's not the being of beings itself.
I've heard it described as, in the same sense that the words that I produce from my mouth,
Yeah,
came from me. You certainly wouldn't go as far to say, well, but also that is Cody.
yeah. But there's this interesting angle because like maybe it is like maybe the being of beings is like not something substantial at all. Because it's very unclear what the being of beings is. And maybe it's not something that's like you can actually reduce
Mhm.
to any particular substance. Like maybe the being of beings only exists in this relationship between tropos and logos.
Yeah.
It's very unclear. And um, I was going to bring this up later, but because we went there, I think it's a good place. It's like, so what is he saying? Like, what about the human person? So a lot of uh, the Buddhist critiques of self-identity have had a lot of influence in recent decades on psychology, neuroscience, philosophy. And the reason why is phenomenologically, they're pretty valid.
Hmm.
Um, if you start doing intensive self inquiry, it's very hard to find like this like actually existing concrete substance,
Yeah, where am I going to get to with it? Yeah.
which is the self. And on Maximus's system, I think this is because what we're normally looking at when we look at ourselves is tropos.
Hmm.
It's this ephemeral movement. It's this mode of how we're exercising our being. So of course we can't possibly phenomenologically like discover a concrete self, even if one existed, because we only have sort of the record of our movement.
Yeah, of our
And our
action.
movement is not a substance
Yeah.
itself. Um and like that actually might be the truth in his system as well, is that, you know, there's the mystic, the pantheist mystic will say something like, I do not exist, only you exist, looking at God.
Hmm.
Um, but in Maximus, you can say this, but it is not in the same sense because there is this divide. The being of beings is so wholly unlike God's being that they cannot be God himself. Um, so maybe there is this ephemerality always to created being,
Hmm.
that it actually isn't a firm substance at all. And you see this when the way that he uses nature, for example. Um, some Christian thinkers tend to use it in this way where like nature is a really concrete universal that you can latch on to. Um, but in Maximus, like it does feel very Aristotelian
Yeah.
almost in how he uses it, because it almost feels like the only thing that nature is what members of a kind have in common.
Hmm.
um, which is interesting to discuss, from the point of view of like often there's a critique which I think is very good of a lot of traditional Christian metaphysics, is that they say, oh, they're too Aristotelian, and that they implicitly believe that there's like a finite number of natures which all came into being and are cleanly separated from each other, and there's no bleed over
Yeah.
between various natures. Um, and the way that Maximus discusses nature, I think he escapes that particular criticism. Um, obviously he isn't anticipating a lot of the problems that we see with like that strict view of nature now, because we come up with the problem. It's like, all right, well, look at Darwin's finches. So they shared nature and now they're
Yeah. Now they're
bifurcated.
different.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
how does that happen? When does one nature become another? But if nature is simply like a collection of shared characteristics, like um the logoi of all this collection like have these ends in common, so
Hmm.
therefore that's a nature
Yeah.
that they have in common. um you would then expect like human nature itself would then probably be something like would have a lot in common with the nature of other living beings or even of inanimate things as well.
Yeah.
That there's this continuum of nature in the created order. And from a Christian point of view, this is almost what you would expect. Um, and you wonder why more people don't arrive at this particular view of nature, because if there's strong scriptural language about this priestly role of mankind in offering up the created things back up to God, the naming of the animals,
Yeah.
etc., etc. Um, that, well, if these things can be offered back up to God in this sort of way, then in the incarnation, like part of the mystery of the incarnation is the nature that Christ took on is perhaps also like related to the natures of all things in the created order as well.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people
Like
get
there's
caught
this
up.
nature of createdness
Yeah, I think a lot of people get caught
in
up
human nature.
sometimes when they're trying to deal with the fact, oh, humans are really special theologically speaking, but they're also created from dirt, right?
Yeah,
Like this is something that I think does confuse a lot of people, and
yeah,
they don't have an appropriate response in the same
yeah,
way that I think Maximus was at least alluding
yeah,
to or moving towards.
yeah. It is interesting to me because a lot of people, including some people that I really respect, have this profound aversion to evolution, not just from the point of view that they believe in some sort of like literal 6 day creation that happened 6,000 some odd years ago.
Hmm.
Um, but that they believe it fundamentally undermines human dignity for human beings to have arisen
Yeah,
out of other creatures.
it
That
violates by
we
saying we were
have we
something
have
lesser.
we have ancestors that were somehow other than we are, that had um, you know, did not have our faculties of mind and speech, like all the things that we think are the dignity of persons. But then, yeah, I think back to the Genesis account. Like, I don't know
Yeah,
how much different is that from being
dirt.
fashioned out of dirt?
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I find what you're saying really interesting, and particularly on this view of the alignment between the tropos and the logos. When I first read Maximus earlier, you said, why is it that people should read these things and so on, and at least in cognitive science where I am. As you said, people are reading religious texts, oftentimes, Buddhist texts, so on and so forth. But you read Maximus and you think he's coming across almost as you could say, like a primitive process philosopher, similar to something like, someone like Charles Sanders Peirce or someone like that. Uh, and it just strikes me. It's like, when people say, oh, what happened to Greek philosophy when Christianity came about? And it's like, well, it continued in Greece, actually. You read this and it's a
yeah,
natural expansion of where you'd think Aristotelian thought would go, and where many people who now rely on Aristotle without ever having read Maximus have in fact gone. With coming up with kind of a process view of the world, aligning it with their telos or their final cause.
yeah, yeah. To go back to the idea of human speech, because of course, like this is one of the meanings of logos, and the idea of, well, learning from nature, etc. There's in um, Ambiguum 33, Maximus talks about like these various ways in which he says there's thickening
Mm-hmm.
of the logos, which you can kind of see as like its manifestation in the created order. So like the highest version of this, like the most obvious version to Christian theology, is the incarnation of Christ. Like Christianity makes very particular historical claims as well as theological claims, and this is the prime mode This is like the way in which, in the created order, the Logos becomes the thickest, is in the incarnation of Christ. But there are also other ways in which we see the Logos in the created world. One is in what you would call the book of nature. He says, you can actually see glimpses of God in the created order, which means even if it's a fallen world and the tropos of beings doesn't line up with their logoi, um, you can in fact see things about the nature of God also in the created order. That there's a rational order. There's things that are revealed in the book of nature. And he also says, well, there's also a thickness of the mind where the word takes on human words. Like actually human speech itself is a place in which God can be made manifest. Mm-hmm. And the highest and most obvious example of this to the Christian mind is Scripture. That all of Scripture is, God breathed in some sense, and has things to reveal about God. And one thing to note is that very rarely are patristic authors naive exegetes about Scripture. They're often working with various shades of meaning. Like they're rarely taking anything other than the Gospels and Acts as something like a simple historical account. They're always looking for some metaphorical meaning. Yeah. That's the level at which like the manifestation of Scripture generally operates for them. And it's not to say that they didn't probably mostly believe that the accounts were also historical, but the historical meaning often in the exegesis is quite secondary to some sort of theological meaning. Like you can read Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses, and no point do you come away with the impression that the historicity of the Exodus matters at all to his account. And this isn't to say that he doubted it, but this isn't the level at which that sort of exegesis is generally operating. And then he says there's also an incarnation in those who engage in virtuous conduct or in the life of faith, which seems, once again, like you're going, the mind often leaps to like other religious systems, especially pantheistic systems. It's like, oh, well, obviously these are like becoming like avatars of God or something like that. But no, it's that the tropos of their being is in alignment, which is itself some sort of testimony to who God is. Because if God has a proper end for persons, that proper end tells you something about God, and those persons who act in accordance with that proper end are therefore going to be revealing something about who God is. And he says one of his other writings, he says, God always willingly becomes man in those who are worthy. That there is like almost this like lesser secondary incarnation in those people who like do what is virtuous or live the life of faith. They are manifested at that point. And at each point, like you have to remember, is that they really believe, as much as the Stoics did, that like this is the revelation of an eternal reason. Like this is something that is analogous to our own powers of accounting and rationality. And this is um, brings me to I've had some friends who are young Earth creationists, you know, ask me, well, there's all these good theological reasons to be a young Earth creationist. And I think the strongest of those for young Earth creationists is sort of the fact that most patristic writers and the writings of Paul also seem to take uh, the Genesis account highly literally in terms of Adam and Eve. Um, and there are all sorts of problems if you look at human beings as coming out of some sort of evolutionary order. I'm not saying they're insoluble, but like if you take that idea very literally, it's very hard to square it with evolutionary biology. And I do think that's a strong objection. I think Christians who do believe in evolution and mock like that particular objection, which there are people who do, like I think that's not giving it full credence. Like there is something that like we still have to grasp with.
Yeah, within that system, there are concerns, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
but what I say is like, listen, I believe in a God that is reason himself and that endowed us with reason. And the evidence is so overwhelming for the relatedness of beings to each other
Mm-hmm.
and their great history and, you know, from the we would know it by DNA, we could infer it by geology, we could infer it by comparative anatomy. There's all sorts of ways that we could arrive at this idea of the descent of all living creatures from a single origin. Um, and I just fundamentally cannot believe that the evidence would be so overwhelming and a God that is reason would make a world that appears to be this way and no, it's a fake out.
Yeah.
Uh, it's just some sort of like weird that got stapled on at some point. It just, it seems to me it's very, very hard for me to square that belief with what Christian teaching says about the nature of God. Um,
I mean, things I think used to be even harder. There was a point in physics where things like eternalism, before we knew, that there was
well, hey, that might be back.
something like, well, right. That might be back as of today. But, before we had this conception of the Big Bang, I think, Carl Sagan said something like, I'm not even going to debate religion because, what you would need to basically disprove it is, proof that, there wasn't a Big Bang. So that kind of ceded all the ground to the Christians in a way that I'm not even going to be able to respond to any theological comments. So it doesn't seem that hard, I think, for Christians now to square their conception of creation with science.
Yeah. I mean, to me, like the idea that the Big Bang versus eternalism is like some particular huge win for Christianity. I've never quite bought into this.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's a
Um,
win, but it makes
yeah,
things easier for people
yeah.
who.
Um, but there are definitely people who believe it is that way. Um, and I, yeah, I mean, like to me, the fundamental question is more the classic, like, why is there something rather than nothing?
Yeah, right.
Like you still have to sort of like go, okay, and the answer that well, you wouldn't be around here to ask the question is completely trite. Like I don't think it's not a scientific answer and it's not a philosophical answer either.
Yeah.
Um, But this does bring me to another sort of back to Ratzinger, though, which is let's you know, I I'm not a strong believer in a directionality of history, but things that often seem very contingent in history sometimes seem to have a purpose and work to some end. And I thought this for a long time. It's like, okay, so Ratzinger talks about there's this division that happens at some point where we divide the former philosophical conception of nature and we narrow it down to those things which we can operate on in the natural sciences, in the empirical natural sciences. And maybe that conceptual division was necessary to make certain discoveries, like modern physics, modern chemistry, the theory of evolution. Like all these things are fruits of reducing the scope of nature and very intently analyzing what can be empirically verified. Um,
Yeah, at
and
no point does he say
physics,
that physical natural reasoning is bad.
right, and physics sort of runs back into this problem all the time of like dealing with the problem of the the shallowness of the scientific conception of nature. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's because physics is so closely wedded to mathematics that you're constantly brought back into like the overwhelming temptation of mathematicians to be Platonists.
Yeah, I mean, if you poll physicists on this who have philosophical
Yeah.
commitments, they oftentimes will tell you they think they are Platonists.
Yeah, it's very or yeah, they have some variant of Platonism or Neoplatonism going on. So like you're already drawn in those sciences back into it. Whereas like biologists, rarely have that pull.
Yeah,
Um,
this is why.
like it's
Uh,
yeah, it's much more normative for a biologist to be like Richard Dawkins in the Ancestors Tell, where he's like, yeah, philosophy of science is worthless and like contributes absolutely nothing to our understanding of things. Um, and I do wonder if it's because you're detached enough from sort of like purely intellectual methods in biology. Um, Biology is a much more empirically grounded science than physics. That sort of like that poverty of nature is not as immediately apparent. And it's not that, once again, every biologist or every single person who's contemplated evolutionary biology has come away with this idea.
yeah,
But it's rare in the biological sciences. Um, there's a book by a guy called Armand Leroy, which is called The Lagoon, which is very interesting. It's actually a defense of Aristotle as the first biologist. And he never sort of like I it's been a long time since I've read the book. He never really comes quite to the point of like saying, perhaps we're like definitely lacking like this thicker conception of nature that exists in Aristotle. And like maybe this is a place where modern biology is lacking something. But there are definitely secular philosophers who've thought deeply about evolution and kind of come away with like, whoa, wait a second, is teleology actually real?
yeah.
Um,
Like I said, I mean, it's in vogue right now.
yeah,
Everyone's talking about it. Yeah,
yeah, like, and I think we're getting to that point. And what I mean is like, so there's this contingent thing where we reduce the scope of nature to make certain discoveries, and now we need to sort of like do the genealogy and find out like what is actually the best conception of nature as a philosophical concept
yeah, yeah.
again. Um,
And this is the division that Kant brings up in Critique of Judgment that Benedict is talking about. Kant said very famously that there will never be a Newton of a blade of grass, because living systems exhibit a teleology that you don't so clearly get out of physical systems, and don't map on quite nicely onto our kind of mathematical conceptions of nature. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and it is interesting too because even highly atheistic thinkers in biology are constantly resorting to this teleological language in order to explain anything in biology. Like any given recounting of natural selection, like always ends up sounding teleology.
yeah,
And and they'll insist, oh well, it's not teleology because there is no natural end to this process. But it's sometimes damned hard to see what the contingency is, like the way that
yeah.
they talk about it.
Terence Deacon does a good job in his book Incomplete Nature of kind of bringing the teleology back into the system. That he says, organisms in a way are, well, okay, so he makes like a standard argument that organisms are these kinds of homeostatic creatures that are trying to maintain some stable state that they have. But he comes up with a story of how do you get that out of non-teleological systems, and tries to develop basically a natural history of teleology, in living systems in a way. Um, and I mean, it's one of the few treatments that I've seen, at least on an extremely secular side, that does say that the teleology is real, and provides very good reasons for saying why we should be allowed to invoke it. But the standard view is, like you said, this kind of, um, I think Ernst Mayr is really responsible for it. Where it says, "Oh, we refer to this teleological language, but really there's no teleology going on. It's just this kind of randomness that keeps happening." And this is something that Benedict addresses time and time again uh, in his book on creation. And it's really interesting that the role of randomness, in living systems, you see people even trying to get out of it at times in physics when they come up with, well, you know, maybe we live in a world that has something rather than nothing because there is selection, random selection among all the different multiverses. And therefore, everything is just this kind of random guided process all the way down, even down to, fundamental ontology, which is like, a kind of laughable escape um, from some of these core issues.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up what I think is, um, if you're going to try to look at Maximus as providing sort of like this teleological
Mm-hmm.
ontology, uh, this variant of Aristotelianism, um, there is a weakness that, unlike Aristotle, Maximus really never discusses what we'll just call artifacts,
Oh yeah.
which are things that are created by persons. So technologies, novels,
Mm-hmm.
poems, uh, foodstuffs, whatever. Like, what is the nature of those as objects? And there's there's this, I think you can come up with an account um, of what artifacts are based on Maximus's schema, but it's not in explicitly in his thought anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So we have sort of like the logoi of whatever the raw materials are that are pre-existent, and then we have uh, a tropos that a crafter imposes upon them. Um, and in some sense, because this new thing has its own telos on the schema, it must now like have a logos. Um, and
A Maximus schema.
yeah, and you could like there are multiple ways you could do this, but the answer that logos is also sort of like eternally conditioned um is not satisfactory to
Yeah,
me.
like I
For,
have
for
a eternally conditioned chair.
yeah, because for a number of reasons. One is I think it violates his idea of tropos and the freedom that's implicit in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is that you run into, if you start attributing an eternal logos for artifacts, you run into the problem of evil artifacts.
Yeah.
Like Ratzinger actually sort of talks about evil artifacts to a degree where it's kind of funny, it's kind of quaint now, but he's like condemning the idea of art for art's sake, where the the only way you can judge art is sort of like its artistic facility
Mm-hmm.
and not whether it is like has any sort of moral goodness
Yeah.
or badness. Um, because there obviously has to, like, even if there isn't obviously morally bad art, and there has to be like there's obviously morally bad art
Yeah.
that's even if all that art also happens to be bad art, like maybe you could convince me of that, like it still is morally bad. And then you go back to the problem, which Maximus rejects numerous times. You go back to the problem of God is somehow the author of evil if there is an eternal logos for evil artifacts. So instead, it suggests that actually human beings have some sort of capacity uh, through imposing the tropos on the logos of like existing substances, whether those substances are intelligible or sensible.
Mm-hmm.
Because a novel, I mean, yeah, obviously there's a sensible aspect to the novel. There's the words on the page or the screen, um, but it's primarily a product of sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and like this actually seems to be the philosophical basis for what J.R.R. Tolkien just sort of intuited as an artist and called subcreation. Like that is actually like, yeah, human beings are also, that is one of the ways in which they're made in the image of likeness of God, is that they actually get
Right.
to create new things.
Yeah, I mean, well, God told Adam to name the animals. He didn't say give them this specific name,
Yeah.
when you name them, right? Like in a way, like humans in that sense were kind of created as co-makers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, and it is like sometimes I think people draw the wrong conclusion from this particular thing, but like what is almost the first thing that human beings do after the fall, which is they make a technology. They make clothes. Um, because they're naked and ashamed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Um, which I think there's like yeah, there's a deeper theological meaning to that. Like, we are aware of our insufficiency and our guilt and our relationship to the world around us. And we do indeed try to bridge that with technology.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Um, and I've been thinking a lot recently about this nature of, okay, well, what if we accept, bracket away Christianity for a moment? Let's just say that we accept, okay, yeah, there's a first mover that also is eternally reason, that all existing things have some fragment of that reason
Mm-hmm.
as providing their ultimate end. Um, and that reason manifests itself in language, which is sort of the sensible clothing by which reason can be expressed.
Yeah.
Um, what type of technology is an LLM? It's easy to go, oh, it's just autocomplete,
Mm-hmm.
because it kind of is a highly sophisticated autocomplete. Uh, but it does in a way, like, but there are ways in which it mimics
Yeah. It's a
the
mirror.
structure. It mimics the structure of reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
It, like, at some point, autocomplete becomes a task very like reasoning.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Um,
produces reason. Yeah.
yeah, or it
It
produces
not to.
something that we can interpret as
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah. You
I mean,
wouldn't
like,
call it reasoning, right?
yeah,
But
because, like, one of the things I kind of enjoy doing, even though from a scientific point of view, this is kind of worthless. Um, so I found that Gemini 2.5's research mode
mm-hmm.
is actually particularly good. Um, and if I it's very good at, like, assembling a list of sources on a complex topic for me and then summarizing those sources in such a way that I know which ones I want to look at.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I sometimes watch its reasoning, its thinking process as it's going. And the reason why is, like, it's actually useful for debugging the process when something is seen to have gone wrong. But the funny thing about it is it's useful for that task, even though that thinking actually doesn't represent what the LLM is doing at all. Like,
Yeah.
that is also this, like, weird epi phenomenon that the LLM is also generating in the same way that might not represent the actions going on to provide the actual result
Yeah.
that you
Yeah.
have. But for whatever reason, it also usually provides you with guidance on how to improve the prompt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's obviously operating in this way completely unlike human reason. Um, because it is more mathematical. I mean, we've discussed Newman, we've discussed Polanyi. Like, it's very, very hard to reduce human reasoning to rules.
Yeah.
And whatever an LLM is, it is a, like, if we decide to agree that it is a form of reasoning, it is a different form of reasoning because it sort of, like, operates from a definite set of rules. And I'm sure, like, there are going to be people who object. It's like, well, yeah, there are probably rules to human reasoning as well. We just haven't discovered them yet. Uh, but every attempt to, like, perform that reductionism has been uh, woefully
Yeah.
inadequate um, so far. And it's not to say that it's impossible. But
Well,
yeah, like,
the
what
rules
is
in the case of the LLM are the rules
yeah.
on the output level,
But
right?
but I do think that there is something philosophically interesting about LLMs, because for the first time we have really made a technology that is, in some sense, really in our own image and likeness.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, the classical argument is like, no, the first time we did this was, like, when the ancient Greeks invented anatomically accurate sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's that's a tremendous achievement in one of the great flowerings of human invention. But it's something very, very different from creating a machine
Yeah, it's not cognitive.
in the likeness of human reason to some extent.
Yeah.
Um, and it is in the likeness of human reason in a way completely other than computing was before, because it seems to operate to us in terms of our natural language.
Mm-hmm.
even if it's you know just doing a bunch of mathematics in the background.
Yeah.
It's the artifacts it produces are the artifacts that we would produce, and
Mm.
there's there's no other technology I can think of that truly creates human-like artifacts
Sure.
in that way.
Yeah.
Like even mechanical reproduction. Um, um, it's interesting because so much thought was exhausted in the 19th and 20th centuries about, well, what is the meaning of mechanical reproduction? Like, what does it mean to be a craftsman anymore in the age of technology? Um, what sort of end, like what sort of ends does our ability to create mass technology create?
Yeah.
Is there a morality implicit in our technical achievements? And I think those are all great and wonderful questions that people were right to ask. And I also think it pales in comparison to asking that question about LLMs.
Yeah. Sure.
Because there is this real danger of people offloading the most uniquely human thing to a machine.
Mhm.
Like the LLM can be a partner, and like that would be the proper end of it as a technology. But there, you just have to look at all the ways in which it's so easily perverted. Is that people don't do their schoolwork anymore? Like they don't actually engage with the intellectual material. They
Yeah.
just feed in the questions to an LLM and give the results out, or they'll tweak some things to try to hide that it was generated by an LLM. They won't engage in that fundamental appropriation of material, understanding, regurgitation. Like that's one failure mode. The other failure mode is believing that the LLM is a person. Um, the people who have delusional beliefs that the LLM is actually channeling some sort of spirit, which they can then have a relationship with. Um, like you know, I I do wonder if the combination of the legalization of marijuana and the rise of LLMs is going to lead to an entirely like new
Insane
generation,
psychosis.
yeah,
Yeah.
of psychotics. Um, and then the other thing is people actually offloading their day to day reasoning
Hmm.
process onto the LLM, not just using it as a partner where you're just like, okay, I'm thinking about these things, give me some feedback, etc. There are people who just like, no, I just like feed everything into the LLM and let it tell me what I need to be doing,
I mean,
like
this is
throughout
what people
throughout my day.
call vibe coding and so
Yeah.
on and so forth.
Um, and it is funny. Uh, I uh, I had like this, and I don't think I was wrong about this, but like when Spotify and various like music recommendation algorithm services sprouted up, I had like this extreme revulsion
Yeah, me too.
towards it as a practice because I was like, well, I mean, like you're just sort of like giving up the idea that you're an aesthetic curator
Yeah.
at that point and turning it over to a machine. And it's maybe okay to use these algorithms for discovery on occasion, but a lot of people just sort of like turned over their listening entirely to the algorithm. No, I just like thumbs up and thumbs down and like let the algorithm always decide what I'm listening to. Like I don't ever approach anything as art in the context of other art
Yeah.
anymore. Uh, for probably most people under 30, like the idea of the album is completely dead. The idea that like you can make these cycles of songs that sort of have some artistic relationship to each other.
And you got to sit there and listen to it for an hour 45 to get the
Yeah.
meaning. Yeah.
And like there all sorts of problems that technology has raised with our relationship to art in particular.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost too easy to consume it casually. Um, to such a degree that like now uh, the most watched television program is something that's like simple and stupid enough that you can put it in the background and not really ever pay attention to it, which is The Office.
Oh,
Like, yeah, it's like this is now how people consume art, is like as an adjunct
yeah, I see.
to doing other things. Like art rarely exists on its own
Something to
anymore.
be
And
appreciated on its own. Yeah.
yeah, and you also see this um, in the way that people experience art as well. Like there isn't art to capturing art, but like most people holding up their phone
Mm-hmm.
at a concert, or
Mm-hmm.
there have been numerous photos and discussions about the fact that now at every papal audience you can hardly see what's going on because everyone's holding up their phone. Like
Yeah.
everyone has to make their record of it. Um and like those records are like mere recording is not artistic production. It's something else. And it's not saying that mere recording never has its place. Um but we provide it with like we give it, there's too much credence we give to mere recording. um I'm a photographer, and I actually kind of deeply hate most wedding photography, um and the role that wedding photography plays, because most wedding photography is really just mere recording.
Yeah.
It's like,
Sure.
let's pose up a bunch of people and take a photo so we remember.
Yeah. Versus capturing the moment.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah. Like, also versus capturing the moment artistically.
Yeah.
Um, I would much rather, and like people get these wedding albums that have hundreds, sometimes thousands of photos. Most of them of, you know, no value other than like some sort of sentimental value.
Yeah.
And
That
then
you
like,
have the
is the
object.
sentimental value would be sort of equally evoked by like 5 to 10 artistic photos,
Yeah.
and
Of the
then
wedding itself. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
memories, like, and human memory is like, to me it's also a relational act,
Mm-hmm.
and it's relational with yourself as well. Like it's kind of a truism at this point. It's like, you don't remember things as much as you like remember the process of remembering them over and over and over again. um which is also like a truth that I think is like you can notice just by self-observation.
Mm-hmm.
Because I remember having this realization when I was like a little kid. Because I was like, I remember my second birthday, but then I had this realization that I wasn't remembering my second birthday. I was actually remembering like the last time I remembering
Oh,
my
I
second
see.
birthday.
Yeah.
Like, I actually remembered the event of like where I was having the memory. And then I was like, well, then obviously, like, maybe I don't really remember my second birthday. I just like remember this time that I remembered it. So like there's this relational aspect to memory, and there's also a community relational aspect. So to take the idea of the wedding, there's like a memory of the wedding that exists for like the persons who are married, the guests, everyone, that sort of like is some sort of collective formation. And the prevalence of like over recording those moments sort of like lets like this apparent objectivity trump the collective
Yeah.
effort of forming a memory that happens in relationship with other persons.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, and And you see this, like, a lot of people now will admit that they extensively engage with their own lives in, like, sort of a prompting by social memory, social media, of like Facebook, on this day.
Yeah, 1 year ago.
Yeah, like, you took this photo. And it's not to say like that's inherently bad, but there's like all these questions that happen even before LLMs about like the proper relationship of ourselves to like the technology that we have on hand,
Yeah.
and the degree to which um my question is always, all right, when you're looking at a given technology, is your use of it making you more yourself,
Hmm.
or is it making you less of yourself? um because like that's the vision that I see in Maximus. It's like, okay, so there's this ever moving rest, and there's this telos. So in a way, your vocation is like, yeah, there's this cosmic thing, there's the relation of yourself to others, the relation of yourself to the rest of the created order, the relation of yourself to God. But in a way, like your most fundamental duty is just to become who you are.
Yeah.
Um, and that is the meaning of human existence. It's like you have some sort of proper person that you are supposed to be. And that's the ethical question that gets raised about technology, is, are you using it to offload completely fundamental human characteristics that you should be exercising yourself?
Hmm.
Are you using it to anesthetize yourself?
Yeah.
That's another failure mode. Um, are you using it to avoid the proper end of some activity? Um, I know, like, this is going to sound ridiculous, but I think about this with e-bikes all the time, and it's partly because it's just a pet peeve of mine because people break the speed limit on my local trail on their stupid e-bikes.
Yeah, I've seen it.
But e-bikes are great for commuting because, yeah, commuting. The point is to get from point A to point B. But then out on the weekends, you see people like clearly taking these like recreational e-bike rides
Right. Yeah.
where it's just like there's no point. There's just like the wandering. And it's like, well, yeah, but like part of the point of the wandering is to sort of like do it under your own power, is to struggle against physical reality,
Hmm.
because you spend your day, uh, you know, being a computer slave and staring at the screen, and you sit in your chair and you fill out Excel sheets and write emails or like whatever, you know,
Yeah, I mean, you're describing my life.
yeah, whatever task, like bothersome task consumes you. Like so many of us, like we're very separated from like physical tasks in our day-to-day life. So like part of what you should be trying to do is like put those physical tasks
Hmm.
back into your life, is to force yourself to sort of confront the elements. And yeah, so I just like turn into this like horrible judgmental person, and I'm like, why the fuck are you riding that e-bike on a perfectly beautiful Saturday afternoon? uh Please pedal under your own power. um
I think this is the first time I've heard someone boomer out over e-bikes.
but no, like, but yeah, it is like, um for me, like, this is almost like too much of an issue because I sometimes have to convince myself of like what the end
Yeah.
of some activity is. I had this discussion with my wife very early on in our marriage, and I was like, I genuinely struggle, oftentimes, to do things that I don't understand what the ultimate purpose of them is, which is a failure mode, right? Like you shouldn't be navel gazing that much
Yeah.
about like what your ultimate task is. Like I recognize that like that's a problem. But that's like in a sense like how deeply rooted like this sort of thinking has become for me. Um and there are good sides to that and bad sides of it. Like, um Jordan Peterson is right. Sometimes you just need to clean your room.
Yeah.
Uh like it is indeed your purpose in some sense to like keep everything in order. I say as I stand in the midst of my office, which I have still not fully unpacked since moving. And it's interesting because all these ideas, like ethics exists on a continuum with your fundamental metaphysical picture
Yeah.
of the world.
Yeah.
And even if you think that it doesn't, it does. I promise you. Um, and there's a truism to some extent. It's obviously not every person who's depressed, but you know, uh, I saw someone tweet recently. It's like, yeah, you aren't depressed. Like you just know that you suck. Like you know that there's something that you're supposed to be doing that you're not doing,
Yeah.
and that's why um, you dislike yourself. And that's often true. And answer is okay. So like, why doesn't therapy work better than it does? Um, like some modes of therapy work for some things. Like you and I've talked about this. Like cognitive behavioral therapy actually works
Yeah.
for certain sorts of problems. Um, but you don't even really need a therapist to implement that. And most of them are pretty bad at actually teaching people how to implement CBT
What they're actually doing.
anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think there's another deeper reason why therapy doesn't work is that therapy, the way that therapy has evolved um, since the rejection of the early schools of psychoanalysis, is therapy has evolved in this way where it tries to be operate in the natural science realm
Hmm.
and tries to not have stances on metaphysical or ethical issues.
Right.
And sometimes you talk to people who are really struggling, and it's just like, you just have a bad fundamental vision of how the world works. And it's led you to also then have a bad ethical vision.
Right.
And you're just spinning your wheels, and like no amount of like, you need to get in touch with your feelings, or you need to not blame yourself, or you need to like reach out to others is going to fix some sort of fundamental philosophical poverty. And this is the nature of philosophy as an enterprise to begin with. Like if you rewound time to fourth century Athens and you told people, yeah, we're still doing philosophy, but like no one believes it makes your life better, they would be like, well,
Why
then
are
what the
you
hell?
doing
And
this?
then why the
Yeah.
hell?
Yeah.
Why the hell are you still doing
Okay.
philosophy?
Yeah.
Um, if you don't think that it leads to any sort of human flourishing,
Hmm.
um, and like that's why, like to go back earlier, is yeah, that's why I think like Gregory of Nyssa is right to reject the eternal return as like being so miserable. It obviously cannot be true. It's like, what sort of good, how would that ever contribute
Yeah.
like like
What goodness is
ethical
in this, right?
personal flourishing? Um, and the objection is like, well, maybe it's just true anyways, and there's no ethical meaning. And then you're like, all right, well, if that's the case, you're going to be miserable. Like, um, yeah. yeah, I recently uh, watched for the first time in a long time, you know, No Country for Old Men.
Oh yeah.
Like, yeah, well, yeah, if the rule you followed, led you here,
But
and like,
what
yeah,
what was the rule? Yeah.
yeah, like that, and that's a statement that seems to be nihilistic. But if you think about it, it's like, well, okay, well, maybe it seems that way if you say that there's no connection between goodness and truth content. But if you say that there's a connection between goodness and truth content, then it's like, well, no, you actually like learn to accept um, the bad that comes to you, and the rule does you lead you to a good place because it leads you to harmony with the world.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, um, and that's one of the reasons why Christianity was initially attractive. Was um, in a world which had like this fundamental sense that for a lot of people that um, worldview was something about preparation for death and being able to face death with some sort of equanimity um, and lack of distress, like being able to face it nobly,
Mm-hmm.
was one of the ends of like being the higher sort of individual. Um, yeah, there's the line at the end of Tertullian's Apologeticum where he's like, you know, uh, those who see us die wonder, the bravery the Christians say, and have in the face of death. And he goes, and when they find out why, they join us.
Yeah. Wow.
And yeah, so what is the purpose of these things? Um, what does it mean that we're creating this language machine? This machine that's in our image. Um, the dangers are very, very stark because, and I think it's like once again, it's like I've never thought about this in like terms of like um, the rationalist crowd that like think that it's going to like invent nanotechnology and then like wipe us all out or some other catastrophic event. I've always thought about this like much more in the terms of Dune,
Yeah.
where it's just like the thinking machines just make everyone less human and kind
Yeah.
of suck.
The kind of degradation of the human
Yeah,
being.
it's I tweeted this back when Dune 2 came out, and I was like, now with the release of Dune 2, America is finally ready for my take that Wally is a Dune prequel, because like that's the humans in Wally is like the ship so totally takes care of them that they no longer really have any human characteristics at all, but consumption. And consumption is like perhaps mere consumption is like the lowest um, human characteristic. And it doesn't mean like I always like it's so funny when people are like, oh well, I don't want to consume that because I don't think it's worth consuming. People like think like um that is like rejecting like all forms of like low consumption,
Mm-hmm.
or it's like just a moral rejection of them as a person. Um, but it is true. Like if you have no discernment about what you're consuming, um, you've given up something essential.
Yeah.
And the reason and I don't know, I've been going off on this tangent for a while now. But the reason I've gone off on this tangent is I see all ideas as being in some sort of like relational tension
Yeah.
with each other. And if I'm going to make the case, hey, uh, maybe these ideas, even if like they come out of this religious tradition that you don't necessarily accept, are worth considering. Um, the downstream thoughts that come out of taking those things seriously, like I think, need to be made explicit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because we do ultimately judge ideas more in that sort of way. Like, very rarely, like, this goes back to Newman, you know, and in the Apologia, which I talked about when we talked about Essay Native, a Grammar of Assent, where he's, the whole man moves, paper logic is but a record of it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually only when you see the sort of life that certain ideas provide that you actually like can come to a point where you assent to those things
That they
versus
make
sort of
sense
like
in the world. Yeah.
fall into them. Um, and yeah, I think it's interesting. Like it is worrisome to me that like sort of like as we're at a point where people seem to be the most struggling for meaning, um, we've invented a meaning generating machine. And
Yeah, we can offload the,
yeah,
the work of
what is
finding meaning onto
yeah, like, you know,
onto a system that doesn't have teleology
yeah,
or any ends, right?
we can, to the next token predictor, we can, offload our most fundamental questions, like not just our fundamental acts,
Yeah.
um, but even the material that would like let us know how to engage in those acts and choose the good from the bad
Yeah.
at all. Um, and you know, so I'm not saying bomb the data centers, but I'm also not saying that we might not have to bomb the data centers. um, uh, I am interested, since the new pope said that there will need to be some sort of encyclical on AI.
Yeah.
Uh, what will happen? Uh, you know, I joked about this on Twitter a while back. I said, just wait until he points at the data center and says Deus Vult. But
I've spoken to some people on the what do you call it, the Pontifical Council for this, and I think that their views tend to be aligned with a lot of what you just laid out just now, which is
yeah,
not the vision that technology is bad. They want to instead, focus on the good things, but give people a reminder that um, as we offload these things, particularly on cognitive tools, right, on cognitive machines, what we are giving up is something human, and so it sucks that the only way that people have appropriately found for dealing with this is some vague notion of virtue ethics, and no one can really decide what is
yeah,
going to be the policy decision for dealing with these things. Like Dan Dennett said, first of all, if you counterfeit a human, you should go to jail. It's like one
yeah,
minimal, but
yeah. This is something I often have a problem with when it comes to modern virtue ethicists. Is I mean, everything that I've said obviously comes across. It's like, well, you're a virtue
yeah,
ethicist,
it sounds like
and
virtue
and
ethics.
I would say, yeah, I am. But I do have this problem where I do think that certain other virtue sometimes finds and chooses another ethical means because that's appropriate for the
Okay.
situation.
Yeah.
Um, and the example I often use is utilitarianism as an ethics of triage,
Mm-hmm.
where you cannot possibly have the sort of knowledge that would lead you to like a maximally virtuous decision. So like the virtue is actually engaging in this sort of like blunt reasoning where you're like, all right, who has like the most quality adjusted life years if I
Yeah,
say,
yeah, yeah. What am I going to do right now?
yeah, like you have to make this immediate snap decision. And the only thing that actually makes that justifiable is actually not utilitarianism, because you also don't have the knowledge to make a fully utilitarian decision. Like you never have that perfect
No, right.
knowledge. Um, but it's just like that's an appropriate lever to pull in that scenario. And then another virtue is actually like the creation of laws.
Yeah, so
It's
there
like
is like a
actually the
yeah.
creation of you know more Kantian style rules. Though
Yeah,
there's an argument that maybe Kant's a virtue ethicist.
he was. I mean, people. This is what people mistake about him is that they thought
Yeah,
that his like deontology was coming up with like personal rules for oneself. No, it was
yeah,
about public duty and justice. It,
yeah.
you know,
Yeah, and this is also like my problem also often with natural law discourse is like if you look at, well, who's like the founder of natural law? Well, it's Heraclitus, but Plato is like the
oh,
first
I
one
see.
to put it in a way that anyone understood clearly what he was talking about. And natural law in Plato is not a universal.
Mhm.
When you read all of Plato, is like actually natural law also means that like you need to take into account all these what we would think of as accidents
Yeah,
in creating the correct rules. Like, he's like, if you're creating, in the laws, he's like, yeah, like the Republic is like this weird, like ideal city where like there's nothing preconditioned. But then in the laws, it's like, okay, what do laws look like when you precondition? And he
Mhm.
does try to choose some optimal conditions for what he thinks will make a good city. But he explicitly says, oh no, you have to consider the geography.
yeah,
That's going to consider the type of activity that the
yeah,
citizens
yeah.
engage in.
There's
You have
like
to consider,
clearly prudence in this system.
you have to consider the nature of your citizens. Like he clearly thinks that different peoples have different natures
Yeah,
and therefore like different laws suit them better than others. Um, so like the natural law enterprise is like not as prescriptive as its
one
critics
assumes. Yeah,
often make it out to be, and as some of its proponents sometimes make it out to be.
sure.
They just say, "Oh, well, yeah, you can just like derive like the perfect government for all peoples in all places from reasoning from correct natural law principles." Like there are some people that border on that sort of hubris. Um, so that's what I do mean is like sometimes I think uh, certain modern virtue ethicists, I don't, you know, others of them are much more careful about this. Sometimes have this allergy to no, the virtuous thing here is to like use this other ethical tool that's sitting over here because that's the easiest way to implement a solution for this
Sure.
case.
Yeah.
Um, and like the most obvious example is really societal organization. Is like you just can't have completely free floating virtuous outcomes. Like, yeah, the closest thing to that is the common law, and the common law still has rules.
Yeah. Well, I mean, dude, like Confucius wasn't anti-state or something like that, right?
Yeah,
Like, virtue ethics doesn't necessarily mean that you have to live in anarchy. But many people, when you invoke virtue ethics as a quote solution for
yeah,
these kinds of problems, basically what they're saying is, well, if you just be better, then we'll live in a better world. And it's like,
yeah,
well, no, that's not.
yeah. It feels like yeah. Teach men not to rape,
Yeah,
kind of rationale about society.
yeah, yeah.
Um, anyhow, I think this is a good place to wrap up, and uh, kind of want to conclude with like, all right, so the basic case trying to make here is that there's philosophical architecture out there um, that you might not be considering for these like fundamental questions that we have today about our relationship to the world, our relationship to each other, what the structure of objects is,
Mhm.
what the nature of the self and self identity is, um, and um, you know, I encourage people to like look out, like read these things, you know, decide what you can take from them and what you can't. And I also believe that you should be doing this with other religious traditions. I think a lot of the philosophical and neuroscience science engagements with Mahayana Buddhism have actually been pretty fruitful. And there's good things that have come of that as well. Um, and so um, we're going to, the next episode, we're actually going to walk back and sort of talk about uh, the fundamental philosopher of Logos, which is Heraclitus.
The first process philosopher.
Yeah, the most. Uh, yeah, there's an apocryphal line of Socrates where someone gave him the book of Heraclitus to read, and he's said to have said, "What I understood of it was excellent, and dare I say, what I did not understand is excellent also." Uh, so that'll be on the plate, and then we're going to actually um, do a couple of episodes more directly related to this idea of AI. With a friend of ours, going to do an episode about Hubert Dreyfus's "What Computers Still Can't Do." It's a book that people often, I think, reject a little bit too easily out of hand. There's the idea that too many things he said have been falsified, but I think there's still some worthwhile stuff to consider about what the nature of computer reasoning is versus the nature of human reasoning that are in that book.
I think what's important to remember about that book is that for a large portion of it, he engages with the critique of symbolic AI
Yeah.
and not the kind of probabilistic AI we still have, but he does have general critiques in there that apply to
Yeah.
both.
Yeah. A lot of the more general stuff about embodiment is more relevant. And then I think Cody and I are going to discuss Ernst Junger's novel, The Glass Bees, which is a meditation on what is the moral end of technology as a process. Is there some sort of implicit morality with technical civilization? Um, and I do think like there have been philosophers who've worked on this topic in more sophisticated ways than Junger, but I think one of the good things about addressing it through a novel is there are certain things that creative literature can do that non-creative literature cannot, which is, I think, why Plato wrote creative literature as well as philosophy. And yeah, so that's the plan for the next month and a half or so. Maybe we'll work in something else. And thank you for listening. If you're listening on YouTube, please like, subscribe to the channel. We're just starting to get some suggestions in from other videos. So people are starting to discover through YouTube. And the more engagement, the more likely that is to happen. Subscribe on the Substack so you can get email updates. Possibly some other essays might go up there. And thanks. And thank you, Cody.